Well, we have pretty much made our way through Deuteronomy 6. And next Sunday is going to be the last Sunday of the spring semester, and then we'll pick back up in June. So we'll kind of do a dash to see how much we can walk through. Just want to say one more thing about Deuteronomy 6, then we're going to jump into 7. So remember, we've said a little bit about this important verse here in Deuteronomy 6, 4, which talks about Israel's response to God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, or the Lord is the only Lord. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. In many ways, as I've tried to say, right, this sort of one verse summarizes the purpose of all of the law that we're going to be looking at in the rest of the book of Deuteronomy. And I just want to kind of make the point here, right, that it's kind of important to see both the forest and then not miss the trees, right, to look at both at the same time. So notice what's going on here. God is working at forming a people whose sole and greatest love is himself, right? And this sort of tells us something about the way that the Old Testament views the central problem of the world. That is, for the Old Testament, the central human problem is that on our scale of loves, there's always something that we put before God. That's our problem, right? And the range of those loves goes on and on and on. But the point is, right, that for the human condition to be what it needs to be, God needs to be restored to us as our first love, and then everything else can be arranged accordingly. And this idea doesn't simply vanish in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. So remember in the farewell discourse in John, right, Jesus tells the disciples, right, that he's giving them a new commandment, that you love one another even as I have loved you. And then remember, he also says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. If you truly love me, then you'll keep my commandments. So that's what we have in Deuteronomy 6. Now, let's take a look at 7. Deuteronomy 7 is important as well because it reflects on what you might want to think of as the election of Israel. And by election here, I'm not talking about people going into voting booths and pulling levers. I'm talking about God electing the people of Israel to be his covenant people, okay? And it's really important to notice here that basically Deuteronomy 7 is really the only place in the whole of the Old Testament where we get sort of a self-conscious reflection on Israel's election. So I want to take a look at this in some detail. So I'm going to start here at Deuteronomy 7:1. When the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering, the land of Canaan, to take possession of it, and clears away many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you, and you defeat them, then you must devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them, and show no mercy to them. You shall not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons, or taking their daughters for your sons, for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall break down their altars and dash into pieces their pillars, and chop down their Asherim and burn their carved images with fire. So just a little word on this. So Israel is going to come into the land of Canaan, and this is important. We'll dwell on this in detail when we get to Joshua sometime in 2026. But the people of Israel are coming into the land of Canaan. And what they're going to find there, as they already have a hint, right? They're going to find peoples who are far more sophisticated and far more powerful than they. Okay, so the key thing about what they're gonna find in Canaan is they're going to find like these city-states, right? And so what we're talking about is escaped slaves who have kind of become like sort of like nomadic herdsmen, coming up against these kind of like powerful urban civilizations with advanced cultures, walled cities, advanced armaments, advanced military, advanced political organizations, and that's going to seem like utterly overwhelming, right? It would be like, to maybe use a good example, it'd be like sort of like Costa Rica facing the United States in a war. That's kind of what they're going to face. And so God reminds the people of Israel of two important things. Look, thing number one, I'm telling you right now that I've promised you this land and you will settle it and occupy it. Okay? So don't worry about that part. I made the promise to you, you will settle in the land. Don't get obsessed with the obstacles. Okay, so don't. And the second thing is this, and this will be crucial too. Once you get into the land, right, you're going to see the religions of these sophisticated city-states. And there's going to be part of you that's going to want to say, oh my gosh, we don't have anything like that. Why don't we become like those sophisticated, educated, upscale people and worship these gods and goddesses? That's going to be the temptation, okay? So God's warning them already not to do that, right? And this is important, not simply because, right, it'll create problems. But if Israel breaks her exclusive covenant with God and in effect starts, kind of collecting religions like some people collect coins or cars, everything that God's trying to do to the people of Israel is going to be undermined. Okay? If Israel becomes just another pagan nation, and throughout periods in her history, that's kind of what she did, the whole mission gets blown. Okay? So this is really important. These are really important instructions. And then now here's the rationale for why God said these two things. This is the part about election. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. Okay, your people, and remember, as we've said before, right? Holy here doesn't mean that the people of Israel are sort of like this gigantic collection of sort of like saints whose lives are like morally impeccable. We've read too much about them to know that that's not true. Rather, the people of Israel are holy to the Lord because God's called them to be his people. Okay? And anything that's associated with God is holy because God's called it to be used by himself. So that's what God's reminding of. And then this. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession. That was the language that God, remember, used way back in the book of Exodus, in Exodus 19, out of all the people who are on the face of the earth. Now, that statement could sort of lead to sort of enlarged egos, right? You are a people holy to the Lord your God. Out of all the peoples in the world, you have been called to be my treasured possession. And the reason why that's the case is because you are all such wonderful, great people. Pat yourself on the back, okay? I want you all to post this on your Facebook pages tonight, telling the world we are a holy people and we are God's treasured possession, so everyone knows this. And then here's the part about election. As I say, this is the only part in the Old Testament where we get sort of like an explicit reflection on Israel's election. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord has set his love on you and chose you. For you were the fewest of all peoples. But it is because the Lord loves you and is keeping the oath that he swore to your fathers, that the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, to 1,000 generations, and repays to their face those who hate him by destroying them. He will not be slack with one who hates him. He will repay him with it to his face. You shall therefore be careful to do the commandments and the statutes and the rules that I command you today. So let's take a look at that. This is a really, really important piece here. So kind of the central point right here is, why is Israel an elect people? Why have they been chosen by God? Why are they, among all the peoples in the world, the people that God has chosen to make a covenant with? Is there something about them that somehow like qualifies them for this, right? Were they like the greatest people? Well, clearly not. Were they like the smartest people or the most religious people or the most moral people? And God makes clear that the answer to all those questions is no. So why are the people of Israel God's chosen people? And I think the brief answer is simply this: because God decided to love them. Now, that's an important statement, because notice what it makes clear. It makes it clear that the people of Israel have nothing whatsoever that might qualify them as God's covenant people. Rather, to be a covenant people is a matter of divine grace and of divine choosing. And that's really, really important. Okay? That is, the existence of Israel, and later on the existence of the church, doesn't depend finally on those who compose it. Rather, it depends on God who chooses and elects. And that's really important. Okay? We'll see this, right? This will come out in several key moments, right? But if you get to the point, right, where you somehow believe that, the survival of the church somehow depends at this moment on what we can see before our eyes, so that every bad piece of church news, right, sends someone into like the depths of anxiety. And by the way, there's a lot of bad church news that could send you to the depths of anxiety. Okay, that's not, right? If that's where our confidence lies, right, we're going to be in severe trouble. But if you look at it from this perspective, right, why did Israel persist through all the stuff that was thrown at her? The answer to that question is the same as, why has the church persisted through all the stuff that's been thrown at her? It's because she's a creation of the electing and calling God. And what God decides is going to exist is going to exist, such that, to use Jesus' words, right, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. So there's a really important thing to remember. Also, notice the way this is phrased, and I think this is really important. God reminds the people of Israel, well, why is it that you were delivered from slavery in Egypt, right? Was it because, you all came to this sudden realization that being slaves in Egypt was a bad thing, and you sort of all got together and kind of said, help, save us? Was it something like that? No, right? We've seen several times where, remember, we've seen the people of Israel, as they were journeying the wilderness, actually thought about going back, right? There's that one point, right, that we read about in the book of Numbers where the people of Israel say, hey, Moses, we're through with you. We don't know what the heck you're doing. We're dumping you. We're going to elect someone in your place, and we're heading back to Egypt, where things were just grand. So were the people of Israel, chosen because they were so brave or courageous or something like that? The answer to that question is clearly no. Why were the people of Israel freed from Egypt? 2 reasons. A, because God decided to love them. And B, because God made a promise to Abraham that he intends to keep, whatever. God made a promise to Abraham that he intends to keep whatever. And that's important. So we have here identified 2 really important characteristics of God in Deuteronomy 7:9. And I just want to dwell on both for just a second before moving on. Know, therefore, that the Lord your God is God. And then here are the 2 characteristics. The faithful God, characteristic number 1, who keeps covenant, and characteristic number 2, steadfast love with those who love him. So notice here, and I think this is really important, when we think of God, right, we tend to jump to what kind of in our minds is God's outstanding characteristics, right? And those tend to be what I call the omnis, right? Well, who's God? Well, he's omnipotent, omnipresent, all kinds of omnis in there, all this, all that, da-da-da-da-da. And all that's true. But it's really important that notice how God identifies here his own sort of 2 central characteristics. Characteristic number 1, God is faithful. Meaning, right, that the whole history of Israel, and as we'll see later on, the whole history of the church, right, is a history of God being faithful to the promises that he made to his people and also being faithful to his creation. God is faithful, right, in the sense that his whole relationship with people is promise-making and promise-keeping. There's no arbitrariness here. Okay, there's no, I've kind of been rethinking that promise that I made 300 years ago, and I don't think I'm going to keep it. Or, you know what? I've chosen you to be my people, and you've been my people for the last 500 years, and you really haven't done all that great a job. So, sorry to say this, but you're all fired, and I'm going to hire new chosen people. That's the way it goes. Too bad. Rather, right, what we're getting God's sort of faithfulness, which persists even in the face of human sinfulness. Okay? And that's why later on in Romans, Paul says something really, I think, important and significant, right? Reflecting on the chosenness of Israel and Israel's sort of lack of response to the Messiah, right? Paul expresses the hope, right, that, there's been this awful moment where God's own people didn't receive the Messiah, but that has been, right, the good news has gone to the Gentiles, and at some point, Paul says, God will sort of use the Gentiles to make his own people jealous so they can be pulled in too, right? So, in effect, right, the history of humankind is the history of God being faithful to his own promises. So that's the larger story. And then the second characteristic, which I think is also really important, steadfast love. In Hebrew, that's actually one word. We don't really have an adequate word for English, so we have to kind of use a couple put into it together. So steadfast love, and you want to even add steadfast love and faithfulness. That would probably round out the idea. So notice this, right, that we were talking about love in the context of loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, right? And I tried to make the point that love here is understood to be an action. And clearly, right, that's what it means for God. Steadfast love means, right, that God's primary response to human beings, particularly his covenant people, right, is a relationship of sort of steadfast loving kindness, which means, right, that God's relationship to us is not simply a reflection of our relationship to him, which is like really good news. Okay? That is, I mean, if that wasn't true, right, this whole story could look very different, right? If this was not true, if one of God's primary characteristics wasn't steadfast love and faithfulness, right, this whole story actually could have come to a screeching halt way back in the book of Exodus, where the people of Israel made the golden calf. And God sort of looks at them and says, okay, well, if that's the way you're going to be, I've got news for all of you. You're fired. Goodbye. That is what we're being told here. And I think, this is the Old Testament's doctrine of grace, right? The idea here is that God's relationship to us as his creatures isn't simply a reflection of our relationship to him. So that what we're going to find, and we've seen it already in significant ways, right? We're going to see that human unfaithfulness is met by the faithfulness of God. Human unfaithfulness gets met by the faithfulness of God. And of course, the ultimate example of this, the ultimate exemplar of this, of course, is the crucifixion, where the human unfaithfulness to God is met by God's faithfulness in the resurrection. Okay, so two really important things about God. Now, notice that the chapter goes on in verse 12. And because you listen to these rules and keep and do them, the Lord your God will keep with you the covenant and steadfast love that he swore to your fathers. He will love you, bless you, and multiply you. And he would also bless the fruit of your womb and the fruit of your ground and your grain and your wine and your oil, the increase of your herds and the young of your flock and the land that he swore that to give to your fathers to give you. You shall be blessed above all peoples. There shall not be male or female barren among you or among your livestock. And the Lord will take away from you all sickness, and none of the evil diseases of Egypt, which you knew, will he inflict on you. But he will lay on you, but he will lay them on all who hate you. And you shall consume all the peoples that the Lord your God will give over to you. Your eyes shall not pity them, either shall you serve their gods, for that would be a snare to you. So notice here we also have the idea that the covenant brings blessings. And we'll just want to remember that too when we start thinking about the new covenant, right? So really important idea, right? Kind of basic theology of covenants. God's primary way of dealing with human beings is through making covenants. We've seen that with Abraham. We've seen that at Mount Sinai over and over again. And, right, the idea here is that implicit in the idea of covenant is covenant brings blessings, right? And of course, blessings here aren't just, like small things. It's not like, God like handing out goodies or something like that. But rather, and this is important, as God draws people back to himself, that means, right, that the original blessings of creation can be restored as the curse of sin is rolled back. That's the idea. Okay, so this is the framework, right, that the gospel writers are reading the resurrection of Jesus, right? They're reading the resurrection of Jesus as not just sort of like, okay, yeah, Jesus is no longer dead, and that means that, death is no longer a bad thing. Well, it's more than that. It's that with the resurrection of Jesus, right, sin and death have been completely rolled back, and now God's covenant blessings to the whole creation can begin to flow in. Okay, so that's good news too. So 7 here, Deuteronomy 7 is really important. Now notice what's said in this is 7:17, and then we'll, if we have time, we're going to skip into 8 very briefly. If you say in your heart, these nations are greater than I, how can I dispossess them? Which we'll see the Israelites will say, right? They're gonna they're going to get like to the edge. We'll see this later on. They're going to get to the edge of Canaan, and they're going to look around, and they're going to go, ah! You know, we can't do this. So they're being reassured. You shall not be afraid of them, but you shall remember what the Lord your God did to Pharaoh and to all Egypt, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs, the wonders, the mighty hand, the outstretched arm by which the Lord your God brought you out. So will the Lord your God do to all the peoples of whom you are afraid. So notice this. This is why history is so important here, right? This is why it's really important for Deuteronomy to continually remind the people of Israel of what they've just lived through. Moses says here on behalf of God, okay, look, as you're getting ready to enter the promised land, and to put this in modern terms, as you're getting all those intelligence reports about just how strongly fortified those cities are, and just about how fearsome their weapons are, and how well-trained their armies are, and how numerous these peoples are, and how sophisticated and advanced they are. Don't simply look at all that and then ask yourselves, are we able to defeat that? Don't do that. Instead, when you find yourself in that moment of fear and dread, remember how it is that you got out of Egypt. You folks didn't think that you were going to be able to escape, did you? In your minds, right, you all asked the question, hey, there's no way in this world that we are going to escape out from under the thumb of the most powerful ruler in the world. It's not happening. Well, guess what? It did happen. And remember how it occurred. It occurred because of my mighty hand and outstretched arm. You were delivered from captivity in Egypt. You crossed the Red Sea, and you were providentially brought through the wilderness. Keep that in mind. Okay. Now, I think that there's something really important here that we don't want to kind of let slide, right? One of the most important things I think about the Christian life, and certainly the life of the church, is it's really important to remember the past. You know, not just for the sake of, acquiring some antiquarian knowledge or something like that, but it's really important to remember the past to gain a solid sense of perspective, right? It's really important that when we're going through like crises and difficulties, both in our own lives and in the collective life of the church, right? We remember that, you know what? This is probably not the first time in the history of the church that people have been through difficulty, right? It's like not new. This is not the first time in anybody's individual history that they've kind of had to struggle with difficulty. The idea here, right, is to remember and take to heart what God has done, and to use that as the lens through which we see the present and the future. We get a sort of an important version of this every Sunday because essentially, right, that's what the Eucharistic prayer does. Every Sunday, right, the prayer that's at the center of the Eucharist, right, is our recalling God's mighty actions. Incarnation, death, resurrection, ascension, coming of the Holy Spirit. We remind ourselves of those things over and over and over, not just because, they're kind of wonderful things to think about, but because they provide the context in which you and I are supposed to be looking at the present. Okay, so that's important. One little brief word about Deuteronomy 8. These are some words of wisdom for the people of Israel as they begin to settle. And so let me just read to you a couple of the first verses and just say one or two things about it, and then we'll stop. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. So there's that phrase, right? That the Lord swore to give to your fathers, that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna that you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. So we're getting an important reminder of why this trek to the wilderness was so important. We've seen one reason why it was important, right? So that the rebellious Exodus generation could all die off. Right? They could all be like filtered out. But there's also another reason here. The journey through the wilderness was a time of testing to begin to school Israel in dependence on God. So God says, well, look, you know what? I knew what I was doing. I didn't have you go through the wilderness just because, that was like a fun thing to do or because I thought there was great scenery. I brought you to the wilderness because the only way that you would survive in the wilderness is if I sustained you. So I deliberately brought you to a place where you had to rely on me. I brought you to a place where the only way that you would ever survive was by relying on me. It was intentional, right? And guess what? It seems that it all worked because you're all standing here. Okay, you made it, so I must have done something. But I think there's something really important here, right? This passage ends, right, with this famous verse, that you may know that man does not live by bread alone, but every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Remember, this is the response that Jesus gives in the Gospel of Matthew when the tempter tempts him to turn stones into bread. You know what, Jesus? If word got out that you could turn rocks into bread, people would be eating out of your hand. Think of the publicity. You'd be on the front page of the Jerusalem Times, the Jerusalem Post, and the David Street Journal, all at once. Just think of it, right? And that's when Jesus says, man does not live by food alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. That is, Jesus is saying, look, I know the importance of dependence. I know that when we're truly dependent upon God, we're actually truly human. As opposed when we're kind of in that false state of mind where we believe that we're sort of like autonomous, self-sufficient, mature adults who can handle everything on our own. That's what somebody said way back in the Garden of Eden. And look where that led to. So it's different. So Israel's being schooled here on dependence, but the thing we just want to remember, right, is the more dependent we are upon God, the more truly human we become. That's a counterintuitive lesson, but it's still true. So what we'll do is next Sunday we'll finish chapter 8, and I hope we'll get into chapter 9, and that'll sort of set us up to now beginning to look at this second version of the law.